Hello, American Prestige listeners. It's Derek, joined as always by my friend and comrade Danny Bester, and we are very pleased to welcome back to the program. Really, this time, I mean it. Very pleased to welcome back to the program one of our favorite returning guests, Patrick Wyman. He is the host of the podcast Past Lives. You may have heard him on Tides of History. Before that, he is also the author of Lost Worlds: How Humans Tried, Failed, Succeeded, and Built Our World. Patrick, thanks so much for coming back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure chatting with you two gentlemen.
This gives me a chance to ask a question that I would have asked when you started season two of Tides of History, because it's sort of the same, covering the same ground. But for somebody whose background was in late Rome, medieval, you wrote your first book, The Verge, on sort of the rise of modern banking and business techniques. What drew you to this prehistoric past?
Well, so I've had an interest in this for a really long time. When I was in graduate school, and I was, and like you got summers off basically in grad school. Like maybe you're doing some research, maybe you're doing some teaching or taking some classes, but basically you're off. And I was really high one day, and I saw the announcement that they had sequenced the Neanderthal genome, and I'm like, that seems cool as hell. And what I found, and this was about 2010, was that there was a really active community of bloggers and kind of interested lay people and people who did genomics but weren't specialists in ancient DNA, who would just mess around with the data and would talk about it. And like a lot of the kind of cutting edge techniques and ideas that would animate the field of ancient DNA and kind of archaeoscience more generally, that was all being discussed publicly in the early 2010s, and you could talk to people who were really knowledgeable and were working in the field just in blog comment sections. And so I got really into this. I'm like, this is so cool. I had the opportunity to develop a course for you at USC on doing history with the natural sciences. So the early ancient DNA studies, paleoenvironmental analysis, isotope analysis. I mean, I got the opportunity to basically study this stuff while figuring out how to teach it, and then I got to teach it a bunch of times to really interested and cool undergrads. Like it was one of my best experiences in graduate school, was developing and teaching this, and then it just kind of sat on the back burner for years while I was finishing my PhD. We get to about 2019, 2020, and I'm thinking, I've done the late medieval stuff as much as I can. I mean, I could go back and do Rome again, but I feel like that's pretty played out. I thought, you know what, I'll just kind of take a swing and see if it's possible. Worst case scenario, I do 10 or 15 episodes, and it's clear that I'm not capable of doing this. But as I started getting into it, I'm like, oh, okay, I can speak this language, I can talk to these people, my questions seem like they're viable. Um, and after a couple of years of it, what I realized was that there really is not a lot of big overarching work on prehistory as a whole. You have subject matter specialists who are great in their particular areas. You have some people who are interested in kind of broader thematic concerns that stretch across the globe, but basically these prehistoric disciplines tend to be quite siloed, and people who are working on the deep archaeology of East Asia are not even really talking to people who work in North America, which causes some obvious problems if you're trying to understand global prehistory and migration streams. And that what I found was that as I was studying all of these different times and places, that I could put them into conversation with each other, and that we could come to a kind of a better synthetic understanding of what prehistory looked like, and that just how much our picture of it has changed in the last few decades. Like, we're living through the most revolutionary period in the study of the distant past in all of human history. Our picture of what the world looked like in the deep past looks nothing like it did even a few decades ago. And that's new archaeological sites, it's new methods of excavation, it's new methods of kind of large scale data analysis, but largely it is new techniques. We have access to forms of evidence about the past that just did not exist a few decades ago. It's the rough equivalent for those of us who are more historically minded of all of the sudden there are 1,000 new archives that you did not know existed. And not only have the books never been looked at, you are constantly discovering as you're looking at the books new ways of looking at them, new ways of analyzing them. And so I'm like, this feels like a pretty good time to try to take a swing at pulling all this together and drawing out some common threads. And I didn't want to come up with some sort of monocausal explanation for why things turned out the way they did, but I'm like, we can explore some really important themes over very long periods of time and paint a new portrait of these people who I think were up to some pretty interesting stuff.
I think there's an irony here that I before we really get into the book, I want to talk a little bit about, which is that all of these new techniques, like this is not a book that could have been written 20 years ago.
No.
It's not something you could have done because all these techniques were still in their infancy. And like the things that you're talking about and that you talk about in the book, strontium, like isotope analysis and ancient DNA, all of this stuff was not developed enough to do this. It's all maturing into this really interesting picture at a time when nobody wants to fund this kind of stuff at universities anymore. And that's true of broadly speaking. I mean, I know you've talked to people who do um historical work, and they're, we're finding new documents, new archives, or there's the hope of finding new archives, to study places that have either been lost completely or have been, under covered or under considered as historical elements at the same time as we have nobody studying the languages because there's no funding for it, like
Mhm.
maybe we could just kind of lay that out for people, like what the environment is like at the same, even as all these things are all these cool things are developing,
Yeah.
how difficult that is.
Yeah, I mean, so there are huge benefits to these new tools. The drawbacks are that they are often expensive to use and they require a substantial amount of infrastructure in the form of labs. And so you can really see this. I mean, I use ancient DNA as kind of the poster child for this, but like you can see these fields are set up very differently. And especially in the beginning, I think there was a lot of disciplinary conflict because of the way that genomics experts were approaching this. I mean, and genetics labs had money, and they have PR people who put out press releases about the new paper the lab is putting out. And so I think like for a lot of historians and archaeologists, it was like, oh, you guys are just parachuting in here with, comparatively enormous amounts of money to say without talking to us about any of this, and you're just going to put out some new papers, okay? And that I think there's still this has kind of left a bad taste in the mouth of a lot of archaeologists, especially people who are more kind of like post processually minded. A much more kind of like people who got very into postmodern archaeology in the 90s and the early 2000s. I think have had a hard time dealing with the idea that we are now dealing in facts again, if that makes any sort of sense, that like we're dealing with the lived realities of people in the past. And I think that meshed really poorly with where archaeology was as a discipline around 2010. So right around the time all of these new techniques started coming into being, the discipline was not well positioned to receive them. And so I think that put us about 10 years behind where we should have been. So where instead of having really interesting conversations about new forms of evidence and new ways of knowing about the past, it was, well, these people don't know what the fuck they're talking about, and they don't know anything about archaeology or migration theory or linguistics or the kinds of conversations that genomics experts wanted to enter. They quite frankly were not qualified to be entering. And now where we're at is collaborative teams that from the outset are building research projects with the knowledge of how they're going to use these tools. So instead of thinking we're going to solve once and for all where the Proto-Indo-European language came from, it's we have this cemetery with 100 burials. We're going to analyze the ancient DNA there. We will be able to talk about the population affinities. We'll also be able to talk about kinship and how people in this cemetery were related to one another, and whether kinship has anything to do with social status, and where the objects in the graves came from, where we source them chemically. And so instead of it being geneticists parachuting in to, save the silly archaeologists. It's now we have this incredible array of tools and we're going to use them all together. The downside of that is that those collaborative projects are hard to set up and they require enormous amounts of money, relatively speaking, in academic terms. In real money, it's their pittances. In academic money, they're really substantial investments. So the fields themselves have to change to accommodate how you use these tools, how you set them up, how much it costs to use them, the lab setup. It's really fundamentally changing how you do archaeology, and it should be changing how we do history, but we're not quite there yet.
So let's turn to the book, and of course, I think the shadow book that you're responding to is Waingro and Graeber's "Dawn of Everything," which
Mhm.
was a big hit a few years ago, and also tried to examine humanity in its beautiful diversity. So maybe we could talk a little bit about how you relate to what you're doing in this book to that book, and how we get at these very macro questions that relate to some degree to what humanity, capital H, is capital I, what is capital C, civilization, and how we should think about these issues.
Yeah, I mean, so I have to say, I really enjoyed Dawn of Everything. I thought it was a really important book in the sense that it was asking questions that needed to be asked. The idea of human agency as being an important thing in how we set up social systems and cultural systems, I think is a dramatically underexplored thing at the macro level, right? Like I think there's a lot of really deterministic ideas out there about how human societies change over time and why they change, and those ideas are almost always tied into climate, kind of broad scale economic changes, and this what we would say is kind of an idea of inevitability in the story of humanity, that we are all, whether we want to or not, being pulled into a world where we live as subjects of states, where we are living in cities, where we are farming, where we are subject to social hierarchies, like that there is writing that's used to administer these. That's the civilization package. And you have on the one hand this idea that we're being pulled there inevitably by kind of amorphous forces of history and the world, and then on the other we have the Graeber and Wengro idea, which is that humans actually have a lot of choice in how we set things up, and that we are constantly reevaluating our social situations and how we want those to work. And that's a really important idea because it's right. It is absolutely incontrovertibly true that at many points in human history, people have made conscious decisions about how they're going to set things up, and that often those decisions have pulled us away from that straightforward path of inevitability toward hierarchy and civilization. That is incontrovertibly right. My problem with the book is that we did still end up there, right? That's my problem with the Dawn of Everything, is that despite all of that choice, we did nevertheless still end up in a world that is dominated by states, that is dominated by agriculture, in which hierarchy plays a role in almost every society to some degree. So if we have all of this choice, how did we still end up there? And the answer that I came up with, and this is a direct, I mean, this is a pretty direct response to their book. And I say this as someone who really enjoyed it. I think a lot of David Wengro. I've interviewed him. I think a lot of his work as an archaeologist. Um, but not that I thought it was too optimistic, but I thought that there was an unanswered question. And the unanswered question is why? Why are we still here? And the answer that I came up with is that while it's not inevitable, there are a lot of forces that have pulled us in the direction of living under the rule of states, that have turned us into city dwellers, that have turned us into people who have to deal with hierarchy. And a lot of that answer is that there are people who benefit from that. And their agency matters too, not just the agency of the masses who may not want to live in that kind of world. The agency of powerful people doing bad things actually matters a very great deal. And that's a kind of a consistent thing that runs through the book, is that there are kings, there are chieftains, there are people who think of their self-aggrandizement and organize societies to serve that sense of self-aggrandizement. That is a substantial facet of human history. And if you want to focus on the agency of the masses, then you also need to take into account the agency of people who want something else. And a lot of the time, those people have won, and their wins matter. Their wins matter a lot in the aggregate.
It's interesting. I'm very very skeptical of arguments about human nature. This is orthogonal to what you're saying. But this is something that I've been thinking. It does seem like one of the things that you find in almost all human societies is forms of hierarchy.
Mhm.
And the way that I put it, especially in our modern period or postmodern period, whatever you want to call it, when people talk about like, oh well, you're critical of capitalism. How else would we organize society? I think that one could organize a society around hierarchies that are unrelated to wealth. Like I think that there will be hierarchies that will emerge almost naturally, whether
Mhm.
it's through looks or intelligence or what have you. But what I think has been peculiar about the last 2000 years, 3000 years is how like forms of wealth have been the fundamental structure and condition of society. And this is where I guess I temper my marks with Weber. I mean, this was the foundational Weberian insight about hierarchy, and it's related to that. And I am, maybe this is why I'm not an anarchist. Fundamentally, is that I do think that hierarchy is almost inevitable in human society, and what we do with those hierarchies is really what might be thought of as the question of politics on like a very like fundamental level. So yeah, I just wanted to say that because I don't really believe in a human nature, and if I do believe in a human nature, it's a tendency toward hierarchy, I guess is
Yeah.
what I would
I
say.
I would argue that the hierarchy based on looks is already here. That's why Elon Musk and Donald Trump are the two most powerful people in
Exactly.
America.
Y'all have heard the Caleb Heron clip where he's talking about why Elon Musk is so mad about everything, and it's because he spent all of that money to go from being a three to a five. And it's like it's one of my favorite bits. It's absolutely fucking incredible. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I think, I mean, because the answer you'll hear from people who are more of the Graeber Wengrow mindset is heterarchy, right? That you're setting up social systems where it's not necessarily based on inequality or inherited inequality, but there are social differences between groups. And to me, I like, sure, absolutely, okay. Sometimes I think that conception of heterarchy is a hierarchy that we don't yet understand, and that's which is not quite the same thing. But I'm like, I'm a little leery of just saying, well, because we don't understand what it is, it must be heterarchy. I'm like, there are different forms of hierarchy that maybe we're not that are not wealth based, and like based on social role, based on access to food resources, based on population health. There are all sorts of ways where some people can be better off than others in a society that's not necessarily tied to visible symbols of wealth or power. And so I would say with that caveat, I'm pretty on board with it. And like, but we can't leave out the societies, and this was one of the things that I really wanted to make sure that I got across in the book, is that those societies that weren't based on obvious hierarchy did exist. They are important, and what it tells us is that we need more axes of analysis, right? That, and so one of the things I try to lay out in the book is different ways of thinking about and comparing ancient societies. So we have this idea in our heads that it's river based agrarian civilizations that are the ones that really matter, that that's where states are born, that's where, that's where we see kings and writing and all this good stuff. And yeah, to a certain extent that's true. But if you think about the languages that people speak on the planet, those are not languages that are descended from ancient Egyptian or Sumerian or Akkadian. They are the languages of steppe peoples and the languages of maritime foragers in Southeast Asia. So clearly, there's another axis that by which we need to evaluate ancient societies in terms of success or failure. There's genetic success, that like the number of people on this planet who have the genes of farmers who were active in Neolithic Anatolia 8,000 years ago. That is billions of people across the planet. There are billions of people who have the genetic legacy of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and those are not places that we talk about as being centers of ancient civilization and being really important to the human story, but they are. And so, what I wanted to do was to try to take this story, because we did go from point A to point B. Like, there's no way around that. And that, I mean, like, to put my beef with Graper and Wengro as upfront as I can. It's that we did still go from point A to point B. So how do I tell the story of going from point A to point B while still taking us on this winding journey of non-inevitability? Like, this stuff did not have to happen, but it did. And so why is that? And when you're thinking about it in those terms, where you have a full appreciation for the variety that human societies can take, like, to come back to something you were saying a little while ago, Danny, that I thought was that struck a chord, is like, I am really short any particular way of organizing human societies. Like, whether we're talking about, post-industrial information age, 21st century society, or agrarian empires, or foraging for a particular kind of food, I am short all of that. All of that stuff we can mess with, we can change, we have agency to shift around. um, what I am long on is humanity. I am long people. I think people are really, really good at figuring things out and adapting. Not every group, not every certainly not every individual, but on the whole, I think if you give people a sense, enough people, like, this set of conditions, somebody's going to figure out a way to make it through that. No matter how bad it is, some group of people is going to figure that out. And so that's the way around inevitability. Is people are going to make people decisions based on the factors that are impacting them at any given time, which is often climate. um, it's always going to be their cultural context. That, like, you can't remove somebody's sense of how things are supposed to be from their actions. Like, that's one of the ways I kind of found to get around the Graeber Wengro versus inevitability debate, is just like, human agency and kind of our cultural programming is operating at every step of the process. It's like I'm sure you guys have seen the now classic post, Jeff thinks the beans have to take turns, this is one of my favorite posts, is like me holding back thousands of years of human progress by saying, by sinking crop rotation by making the joke that Jeff thinks the beans have to take turns. And, like, there's something really deep in there, right? That, like, how many wonderful discoveries in human history have been prevented by somebody being like, well, that's the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard. Like, think about the first guy to milk a cow. You think that guy, people were looking at that guy being like, great idea, buddy. Like, that's, and now we have dairy based pastoralism as one of the major sources of calories for huge numbers of people on the planet. First guy to get on a horse, nobody thought that was a good idea. Like, that guy was drunk on fermented mare's milk and hopped on the back of a horse somewhere on the Eurasian steppe 6,000 years ago. Nobody knew that those kinds of acts were going to change the world. And when we're trying to think about human innovation in the grand scheme of things, you need to leave room for Jeff thinks the beans need to take turns, and some very odd guy being like, you know what, if you drink the stuff that comes out of the cow, pretty good. Like, you have to leave room in your understanding of human social and cultural development for that stuff. If you don't, it doesn't make sense.
The first guy who looked at a lobster and said, "I think if I break this monstrous looking thing open, that'll be tasty, some tasty
Yeah,
eats." That's the
yeah,
one that always gets me. Like, who looked at that and said, "Hmm,
yeah. This
that
is
looks good."
yeah. So there's something really deep in that, right? That, like, if we're thinking about the transition to the Holocene, right? So as we come out of the last ice age into a climatic world that looks like the one that we know today, like, the characteristic development of this period is what we call broad spectrum foraging. So instead of one group of people chasing kind of their preferred food source long distances over the landscape, people are settling down a little bit more. They're becoming more intimately familiar with the plant and animal life in any one region. And this goes in a bunch of different directions. One of them is, people are like, all of a sudden, people start exploiting shellfish, which has never been a major food source, or rarely has been a major food source for large numbers of people. People start exploiting things like acorns, like nuts. Again, not a preferred food source for the vast majority of humanity's time on the planet. And farming grows out of the same roots. It's because all of a sudden you're like, oh, I understand the patterns that these plants grow in. I understand that if I drop these seeds over here, they will sprout the next year. I know this because I am actually here next year when these things sprout and grow. And so all of this stuff is kind of coming out of the same roots, but we can take it in 1,000 different directions. And that's exactly what we see around the planet. So yes, there is, I mean, it's like doing ABCD testing that when you expose different groups around the planet to these conditions, a lot of the time they come up with really similar solutions to them. And that's not human nature, but it is if you have a limited set of choices and these conditions, there's convergent evolution. And we see that all around the world with the invention of farming in this period.
I mean, you see it in modern times with the invention of the
Mhm.
telephone. I mean, this is
Yeah.
something that
Mhm.
you see repeating when there's certain structural pressures pushing you in a particular
Mhm.
direction. You're going to have people in wildly different times, not times, wildly different spaces producing very similar innovations.
Yeah.
Another stupid one, but like in the mid 2000s, you found a lot of people do social media sites,
Mhm.
right? MySpace, Friendster, Facebook. There was a Columbia one, I forget what it was called, but like there are certain pressures, there are certain technological ways to do things, and then all of a sudden 5 people invent the same thing. So I think this is actually another feature of human existence.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. This is, and think about how much different that story is of the people who were doing these things, because that turns the people that we're talking about from being automata who are basically just responding to outside pressures in some sort of straightforward and logical and predictable way into active agents who are bringing the all of the cultural baggage that they have to these situations in which they're finding themselves. So the lobster is a great example of that. Like, if you show up in a place that is just full of lobster or full of fish or full of shellfish, and you have no idea how to exploit maritime resources, that doesn't do you any good. You need to have both the cultural concept of this thing as an acceptable food source, plus the technology to exploit it, plus the social mechanisms that allow you to live in a way that you can exploit that. Like, and so when people treat like sedentism, subsistence as being kind of like, well, it's all the same thing. It all comes together. People live in villages and they start farming. No, no, those things don't happen together. Those are not necessarily connected things. They are different facets of human development over these periods of time. It's perfectly common to have farmers who aren't sedentary, and sometimes you do have foragers who are, right? Like, those things are not set in stone. They're different aspects of how you put together a human society, right? And when you package them all, those things do become packaged at some point, but that's a distinct point, and it's not the point at which people are first messing around with farming. There's a whole it's like 3,000 years afterwards. A lot of stuff had to happen to get to the point, to get to that point. And the thing we can do now is understand prehistory as a historical period in which things do change and happen, right? Like, now that we actually have the tools to be able to break down 100-year period 5,000 or 7,000 years ago, you can see that, oh, things are happening over the course of 100 years. It's just that our ability to access those timescales, and thus these really specific instances of human agency and choice and decision making, now we can get at those in a way that we never could before.
Yeah, I mean, just the one thing that's always fascinated me about this, like the process of coming to even consume some of these things, like
Mhm.
acorns, as you mentioned, or the seeds of grain plants. Like, these things require processing before they can
Mhm.
actually provide. And somebody had to work out that, like, oh, I can't just eat an acorn. I have to boil it to take all the bitter taste out. Or I shouldn't just eat these seeds. I should grind them up and mix them with water and bake them on a rock to make bread. Like, it's just like all these things that had to happen for those to even become viable food sources is just fascinating.
Yeah, and the story doesn't always go the way that you think it does. I mean, I am really fond of the explanation for like for great for early exploitation of wheat, for example, that sees it as this was probably for fermentation, that um, people were first exploiting grain as plant foods as intoxicants, And as time goes on, they're like, oh, you know what? I guess we could eat that. We're pretty hungry. We're like, we've got a shortfall of a gazelle this year. Why don't we eat more of this stuff? And when you start thinking about our journey toward food production, farming, kind of scaling up in those terms, the story looks different. It's a lot more human. It's a lot more like people responding to the pressures that are around them in the world in ways that make sense with the cultural baggage that they have. And so like they're a great example of this in China. This is one of the heartlands of the development of agriculture. At least two and probably three different places in China, there's independent development of plant domestication and farming. But in the Yellow River Valley, which is where millet is domesticated, a couple different varieties of millet, also probably pigs. Um, in this region, they had grindstones a long time before they were using millet as a staple. Grindstones came before millet. So they already had the technology before they were ever exploiting millet on a large scale, is because they were big into acorns, right? They developed the technology for the purpose of processing acorns. And then after a while, they're like, you know what else we could use these grindstones for? Millet. What a great idea. So the technology precedes the exploitation of the plant food. The grindstone doesn't develop in response to the perceived need for something to grind up millet. They already have it, right? And that's also true of like places where they were processing ochre as a decorative pigment, right? Like they're using the grindstones for that before they're ever using them for processing plant foods. So when we can actually zoom in and see these things, like the process starts to look a lot less logical, a lot less straightforward, and it starts to look a lot more like what we understand technological and cultural development to be in historical periods. It's like people haven't changed. What has changed is our access to their actions in ways that allow us to make sense of them.
So maybe we should talk about the first part of the book, which deals a lot with the rise of agriculture amid basically climate change. And I bring this up because climate change is obviously something we talk about quite a bit on this show, and humanity's ability or inability to respond to it. And I mean, your argument is the optimistic one, right? That people have in the past adjusted to massive climate changes, and they will continue to adjust. Whatever happens, they'll figure out a way to keep going. So let's talk first, maybe for example, about the Clovis culture, because I find this really interesting. These, the Clovis people come to North America over the Beringia, the landmass in the Bering Strait. Everything we have about them from ancient sites, from archaeological digs, suggests that they're big game hunters. That it's all the technology is geared toward big game hunting. But as the climate shifts and we enter the Holocene period, and the grasslands that support big megafauna, because it's like jackpot when they get to America, right? There's these
Mm-hmm.
huge animals that don't know what a human is, like don't really have any reason to
Right.
be scared of people. It's just there's no competitors. It's just
Yeah.
a wonderful environment. But the climate changes, the grasslands go away, and the megafauna starts to go away, and yet these people who are totally, as far as we know, associated with big game hunting, find a way to adjust and become basically the ancestors of indigenous Americans, up and down the Western Hemisphere.
It's one of my favorite cases because you can see all of these dynamics playing out where we know from ancient DNA evidence that the initial founding group of the Clovis people was maybe a few hundred at the very most, and probably more like a few dozen people. And so from this very small group, millions upon millions of descendants, right? And I think that's because they hit the Americas at this real demographic sweet spot where there's very little competition. They have a way of life that is extraordinarily well suited to the initial conditions that they find. And by the time their way of life kind of runs out of steam because the megafauna have been hunted to extinction, and the combination of that and a change in climate has reduced their numbers to the point where that is no longer a viable way of life, there are enough Clovis people living in enough different places that it's like, okay, we're going to run 17 different models of how you can adapt to a changing climate. And a whole bunch of them worked. that's the part that I find really fascinating, is that the descendants of the Clovis people didn't find one solution. They found 1,000 different solutions to living in this new world. And that to me is the story of the Holocene. Is like there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, you know, and the Clovis people found, the descendants of the Clovis people found almost all of them. You know, they're the descendants of this group. They develop maize agriculture. The descendants of this group develop, you know, the crops of tubers in South America. The same descendants who develop different techniques of maritime resource exploitation along the Andean coast. Their descendants also become big game hunters again on the Great Plains, hunting bison when those become more abundant. Um, that some of them move east and become reindeer hunters. Some of them become forest dwellers in what are now the forests of eastern North America. There are so many different ways you can go with it. But because they had all of that initial demographic success, they didn't have to be bound to that one way of doing things. So the alternative case that I compare the Clovis people to is these reindeer hunters who were kind of wandering around northern Europe at roughly the same time. They didn't make that choice, right? The choice they made was that they were going to follow the prey animals that they were used to further north. And eventually they leave a very small genetic legacy, but for the most part, they kind of disappear. They're subsumed into the changing pot of hunter-gatherer ancestry that we see in Europe at that time. So it's not a given that groups would find success. Plenty of groups did in Europe as the younger Dryas gave way to the Holocene, but those reindeer hunters weren't among them, you know? And so you can see really the gamut of possibilities for these different groups, that some of them hit it right, some of them didn't. You can see how the choices they made impacted that. You can see like groups that remain stuck to a specific way of doing things and aren't adaptable, they tend to be less successful. And that is something you can see playing out over the very long term. You can see like the climate runs throughout this book. It's absolutely everywhere because climate is the baseline set of conditions to which we're all responding all the time, whether we're aware of it or not. But climate change is not impossible to deal with, but you do have to deal with it. You can't just pretend that nothing has changed or that we can keep doing exactly the same things. There are better and worse ways of dealing with it. You know, like I'll use New Orleans after Katrina as a great example of this, because you can make the argument that Hurricane Katrina was at least influenced by changing climatic conditions in the Gulf of Mexico in the early 2000s, right? This is not to say that climate change causes Hurricane Katrina in a direct sense. It's not to say that climate change thus causes the kind of hollowing out of New Orleans that we've seen since Katrina, right? There were decisions that were made by people at every point in that process about how to protect New Orleans from the possibility of massive flooding, about what's supposed to happen in the midst of a disaster. Where do people go after a disaster? How do you provide for those people if and when they return? How do you change? How do you respond to climate change? It's not about the climatic conditions. It's about the choices that people make in response to those. And obviously, your choices are going to be constrained by what the actual climatic conditions are. You don't have infinite choices, but you do have choices. And there is, just as there is a potentially very different version of New Orleans today, 20 some odd years after Katrina, so too with ancient societies, you know? Like you would think the Netherlands would be extraordinarily vulnerable to climate change, and it is. But the reason why the Netherlands has not sunk under the waves, and why instead, you know, climate proofing has become an enormous industry in the Netherlands, is because they haven't pretended that it's not happening. You know, these are people who are used to dealing with a constantly shifting sea level and have developed a variety of tools, at both conceptual and technological, for dealing with that. And same deal along the Andean coast 4,000 years ago. Those people were living with El Nino events, the likes of which are almost impossible for us to imagine, but that was part of life. They dealt with it. They built their societies in such a way that they could deal with, you know, massive sea level rise, enormous storms, periods of intense aridification, shifts in the availability of different resources. That was baked into the way they built their society, right? Because they had to, because you couldn't survive there otherwise. And to me, that's an inspiring thing. It tells us that if we take it seriously, we can. If we actually say like, you know, take Houston. build the freaking Ike Dike, you know? Like it's not that complicated to build the infrastructure necessary to manage some of these challenges, but you do actually have to do it. That's and that's the thing that you see over and over again is like if you take the steps, you can be shockingly successful even at times that seem like they are objectively very climatically difficult. You know, the Oxus civilization, now known or sometimes known as the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. This is an extraordinarily important but pretty short-lived urban civilization in what's now Turkmenistan, and like these people came into being at a time of intense climatic stress. It was drier. It was genuinely worse to live in this place than it had been 500 years before. And yet, this is the time when cities appear. It's because they've figured out like we need to focus on the oases. We are going to need to focus on moving trade goods and generating surpluses that we can use to trade for more agricultural products. So it's not impossible. They did it at a time when it was objectively harder to build a civilization in the oases of Central Asia. But they did it because they came up with a solution. They didn't pretend the problem wasn't there.
Yeah, and then, like, seeing what the political obstacles are. I mean, if we knew more, it'd be interesting to see how they dealt with, like, the question of politics. Why don't we move on to this period that you call the Long Neolithic, and these origins of complexity in complex societies, and tell us that story. And I mean, I just love what you're doing, which is relating to the issues we have today. But what is this Long Neolithic period?
So I think that in our story of prehistory, we jumble a bunch of things together. And we jumble together the origins of farming, the development of agriculture as a thing that you can do with the development of farming societies. And the argument that I make is that those are two different processes. That it takes thousands of years for people to get to the point where you can even build a society on food production, to where you figured it out nutritionally, you've figured it out in terms of landscape usage, you've figured it out in terms of the social technologies that are necessary for you to like live with other people in close proximity. I mean, there's a disease aspect to this. So some James Scott talks about this a lot in Against the Grain, is like the Neolithic multi-species resettlement complex, that like we are bringing together basically a concentration camp of new of things that are not meant to go together in terms of plant and animal life. And you got to figure out how to make that work. When people did get that figured out, which they did all across the planet after about 6,000 BC, I would say between 6,000 and 4,000 BC is the real turning point here. Once they figure that out, these societies expand with extreme rapidity all over the planet. So this happens all over East Asia. It happens across Western and Central Asia. It happens across South Asia. It happens in Europe. I mean, it happens. It not quite happening yet in the Americas. It takes a little while longer there, but eventually the same process happens. It just takes a couple thousand years longer. That all around the world, you can see this shift happen where you get the marriage of farming techniques with sedentary life, with the village model, and it turns out that this is almost infinitely reproducible, and it's just like mitosis. You know, you get these people move to a new place, they change the landscape to suit their needs, they replace native flora and fauna with the things that they've brought with them, and usually this leads to population growth. So these Neolithic societies in demographic terms are just incredibly successful. They just have tons and tons and tons of babies, generation after generation after generation. We know this now because of ancient DNA, that when you look at these rapidly expanding Neolithic cultures, they are not convincing the foragers who live there to join them. It is the descendants of previous farming groups moving into new regions and bringing the technology with them. This is one of the big questions that we have essentially solved in like this a major question as to how everybody came to do this. We now know that it is different groups having different levels of demographic success over time, much more so than it is like these hunter gatherers thinking like, oh, that's a really cool way of setting things up. Farming sucks as a way of life. It's not that great. Like your health outcomes are often worse. You're living in more restricted spaces. Like like your teeth are worse, you know? Like it's not a great way to live. And I think there's like one of the reasons that people end up in these farming societies is not by choice, it's because otherwise you starve. and that these farming societies are much more a response to demographic pressure than a result of it. That if we're looking for the origins of these groups, it's like people are living in these regulated villages. They're growing a limited set of plant foods. They're tending a limited set of animals. They've hunted everything else in the region to extinction. Like they kind of have to settle into this way of life. So that changes your portrait of the Neolithic quite a bit, because rather than this being the kind of inevitable step on the ladder of human progress, it's like, God, we're kind of stuck now. And it just so happens that this allows us to have tons of babies, even if their quality of life, their health outcomes, their lifespan are shorter than the hunter gatherers who came before. Like you're just pumping out humans. And over the course of the long Neolithic, one of the fascinating things I found is this is our first great age as a species of landscape modification across the planet. That fundamentally altering the way the planet looks and how we can live on it is not a function of the Industrial Revolution. It's a function of the Neolithic. That by the time you get to about even 3000 BC, we have dramatically altered what is living on this planet across huge swaths of land cover. And we're going to change it even more once pastoralism really gets going after about 3000 BC. So even by the time we get to the end of the Bronze Age, people have already indelibly altered the planet in ways that were not possible even a few thousand years before. That is a massive change. And in the grand scheme of the human past, that happens really fast.
I want to ask about the linear pottery culture because this is really interesting to me, and what we know about the like collapse basically of that society into violence and cannibalism. I mean, this is a group that had effectively taken over northern Europe by about 5000 BC, and because of ancient DNA, we know that these people were related. It wasn't like a cultural package spreading, as you said, previously. It's not like unrelated peoples adopting a cultural package. This is a group spreading out and being so successful that they're able to basically take over this massive region, and then somewhere around 5000 BC they just start killing each other, and like in these practicing cannibalism, like just complete, it seems like, breakdowns. Talk a little bit about that story because I think it's really interesting.
This is one of my absolute favorite examples, because if you're looking at the linear pottery culture around 5000 BC, like, yeah, sure, there are some signs of kind of internal tension and violence, and maybe the population densities are getting a little bit high, but there's nothing to suggest that this society is just going to rip itself apart over the course of probably decades. Like, but for all intents and purposes, the linear pottery culture had won. Right. This is one of the most stunning examples of success that we see in the Neolithic. This group that is probably a few hundred people at the start, they're living on the fringes of the Neolithic world, probably in what's now kind of Western Hungary or Eastern Austria, somewhere along the upper Danube. And they developed this really specific way of life that's based on building huge timber longhouses. They only grow wheat, they only keep cattle, and they only like to live on these patches of loose soil. So it's this kind of fine, wind-blown, this aeolian sediment that's laid down at the ice age. Really easy to farm, and really easy to farm intensively. So these people spread out. A few hundred people become thousands, and then tens of thousands, and then probably hundreds of thousands, and they're everywhere. And you look at this and you think, like, this is just the prime example of what the Neolithic is all about. These people have figured out a way of life. It's viable. They have demographically expanded. And then for whatever reason, it just stops working. And you get a whole bunch of massacre sites. Like, it's rare to find a single massacre site from prehistory. We find a bunch from a really limited period of time that are all related to this one culture. Like, something really terrible happened. And I think it's like they hit the limits of what was possible with that way of life. They expanded as far as they could. And we can see that whether it was the social technologies that they had, their ability to kind of manage conflict within a homogenous but divided culture, whether it was that, or it was that there was just nowhere else for them to expand to, or maybe there was a little climatic thing that made it harder, that put some additional pressure on them. We don't really know. But the fact of the destruction of this culture is pretty irrefutable. Like, over their entire range, populations contract by at least half and probably more. Like this formerly thriving area is just emptied out. And this only takes a few decades for this to happen. We don't really know why, but it's a pretty stark example of how things can go wrong. That like this is not a case of just line inevitably go up. That the busts are just as much a part of the story as the booms. And like the analogy that I use when we're talking about this kind of inevitable sense of progress is that like if you draw a best fit line between between 13,000 years ago and 3,000 years ago, yeah, sure the line goes up. But like whether we're talking about population or general social complexity or density or like whatever metric you want to use, sure the line's going to go up. But like when you zoom in on any 100-year or 500-year or 1,000-year period, it's going to be a real squiggly line that you're trying to draw a best fit line between. That populations don't rise steadily, they boom and then they crash. The social complexity doesn't go steadily upward, it booms and then it crashes. And it's these ongoing cycles of complexity, of intensification, of population growth, followed by the busts that matter. So, because those are the experiences of real people, right? Like, we're talking in kind of vague terms about social collapse. Like, living through a time and a place when people come and destroy your village and then eat some of you, like, not great. You know, that's a real thing that lots and lots of people have experienced over the millennia of human history. And this was one of my problems with the Graeber and Wengrow book, is I'm like, this is a little too sunny for my taste. And when they would talk about like, well, there's some sort of revolution happening here, like, you know what happens in revolutions, man? Like people get hurt. Like those are like nasty stuff happens. And so it's not that I wanted to like take them to task or something, because again, I like the book. I think it's a really good book. I couldn't have written this book without it, but there's a lot to deal with that they didn't really get into that I thought was important. And like the bad things that we can and do to one another are part of that. So is the fall of these societies. So is the fact that a lot of people did have still ended up oppressed, you know? We can like we don't have to be that way, but a lot of us are. So how and why?
So there's a lot of ages, but let's talk about the Bronze Age.
It's one of my
Patrick,
favorite of the ages. That's
what
that's a
a
that's a
good
wonderful
Really,
segue, by the
from the
way.
standpoint of ages, it's one of our best. Many have said this.
Maybe the
and
third best, even.
maybe the well, that's that's good. There's no gold age. All right, so let's talk about the Bronze Age and what you think previous scholars have misunderstood about the Bronze Age and how people approach it, and then we could also talk about the thing we love talking about on the show, which is the infamous Bronze Age collapse and why that happens.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I think. Sorry, Patrick. Just to piggyback on that, I think in particular the construct of civilization is interesting, and in some of the same ways as farming, I guess, that people have tended to look at it as a linear process, or tended to read back. Like we look at the societies that uh, I guess made it, if you want to say that, and we see, there's cities, there's hierarchy, there's state structures, there's writing. That must be what civilization is, and like we read that back into like the entire history of this period, and it feels like it discounts a lot of, as you've talked about, experiences that don't fit that package.
yeah, it's one of the things I find really funny when people are like, "Well, you know, that is civilization, and this is how we define success." And it's like, you know, there were lots of urban civilizations that didn't make it, right? Like, it's not like like building a city and constructing a state means that you're good forever. Like, that we're cherry picking. And there are good reasons for that. That when you think about the way these disciplines are structured, like one of the reasons why we place so much emphasis on Egypt and Mesopotamia is because that's where archaeologists went in the early 20th century. Like you wanted to go buy some old shit, you sent a purchasing agent to Iraq, and that guy was like, I was doing an episode about a guy called Gebeline Man recently, and the guy who found him had a very funny name that I cannot remember, but I'm like, oh, this guy was just a tomb robber, like this. And you read about this guy, oh, Wallace Budge. That was the guy's name, Wallace Budge, which is the most like turn of the 20th century Victorian guy going to a colony and taking shit name that I can imagine. Like, so, but this guy is like, you read his Wikipedia page and you're like, oh, so he was tomb robbing in Egypt and he was tomb robbing in Mesopotamia, and he claims to have excavated this site, but he actually probably just stole the stuff from some farmers. Like, this is this is what archaeology was. And so if you are our narratives about, quote unquote, progress and civilization are largely rooted in the fact that like that's where they could go. And so, of course, they were going to write the story of civilization from the perspective of the material that they had 100 years ago. And now we have a lot more. We don't have to focus on those places. It's not that Egypt and Mesopotamia are unimportant, not by any stretch of the imagination, but like focusing on them is cherry picking the things that is just cherry picking out of this kind of vast tapestry of pasts that we have available to us. So, okay, coming back around to the Bronze Age. I'm a huge fan of the Bronze Age. It does help us understand pretty directly, like, why people might have actively chosen to live under the rule of states. That like this wasn't just bad kings forcing people to live that way. It's also, well, I'm the king and I have an army, and you don't need to be worried about somebody coming and burning your village. That's not the worst deal. There are worse deals out there than that. You pay me some taxes, I have an army. You can live a really good life as a common person at a whole bunch of different places in the late Bronze Age. So I have a whole chapter that's just called Peaceful Lives in the Late Bronze Age, where, like, if you lived in Minoan Crete around this time, you probably would never have experienced an actual war in your lifetime. You might never have experienced interpersonal violence at anything other than a kind of a basic, like, those two guys got in a fight because they were drunk level. Like, that's not a bad way to live. The people who lived at Deir el Medina, which is the settlement where the workers who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived, incredible archaeological site, one of my favorites. These people have no signs of violence on them, right? Like, they don't have healed traumas. They don't have like these people were not stabbed in the back or like had their skulls crushed. Like, that is a really good reason to say, you know what, not a huge fan of the tax thing, but the king's maybe got something going for him. And the kind of anti-statist, more anarchist perspective misses those attractions. That like, if you live in a world where there is a real chance of somebody coming and killing you, or taking you and selling you into slavery, or just stealing the stuff that you've worked so hard to accumulate, people will make choices about security and safety, right? Like, those things actually do matter to people. So I think that's something we miss about the late Bronze Age is like, there's this whole state system. Yes, there's war. Yes, there's war on a large scale, war on a previously unimagined scale. But a lot of people don't have to worry about violence in a way that they would have centuries earlier, living in smaller scale societies. That's a trade off that a lot of people are willing to make. Um, the downside is when those states go away, people are subjected to more violence, and they're subjected to violence on a scale that they previously weren't. So the Bronze Age collapse, I'm absolutely fascinated by it because it's the first time where we have a lot of evidence to work with to understand how a collapse can happen, how a collapse can actually work in practice. That doesn't make it any easier to suss out. The more evidence we have, the more complicated it looks. And I think rather than being something to explain away, that's actually a feature of how complex social systems can fall apart. It's that you don't actually know how the different pieces of the system connect to one another. You don't know how, let's say, closing the Strait of Hormuz is going to affect fertilizer, is going to affect your ability to produce enough surplus crops to feed the planet's population. You don't know how, in the case of the Bronze Age collapse, a relatively minor drought in Greece might create a cascading series of social issues that lead to the migration of a warrior class around the Eastern Mediterranean. That's what I think the most plausible explanation for the Sea Peoples is that they were out of work soldiers from Mycenaean Greece who already knew the Eastern Mediterranean, knew how ships worked, and were like, piracy? Not bad. Not a bad way to make a living in tough times. Like, these are really plausible ways of connecting the kind of disparate pieces that we see in the Bronze Age collapse. But if we take that seriously, then that means that complex systems are actually pretty fragile, and that you don't know where the stresses that are going to eventually blossom into kind of a fracturing event come from. There's that, to me, is like when we read about scholars in the Bronze Age collapse, there are some who say, well, this isn't a collapse at all because look at how much survives. Like, okay, I'm amenable to that argument, but to me, that's not that there wasn't a collapse, that's that nothing is ever completely gone. Like, if your idea of what a collapse is that one day there's something and then the next day there's nothing, almost nothing that's ever happened fits those criteria. Like, the dinosaurs didn't die in one day. You know what I mean? Like, that meteor, like, there was still stuff to do after the meteor hit. And I think that's not a bad metaphor for understanding social collapse more broadly. Is even in the most extreme cases, there's still a quarter of the people who were previously there the next day. People still got to get up the next day. They got to find a way to feed their kids. They got to find a way to move forward in life. So even a collapse is like, in the strictest sense, is not a collapse. It's a radical transformation of social realities. Okay, if you want to use that term, I think I would just call that a collapse. I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with that language. But yeah, I think the Bronze Age collapse is a great one because you can actually see working just how widely separated these pieces are and how little obvious connection there is between them. But if they're all happening at the same time, they're probably connected in some way. It's just hard for us to figure out. And to me, that is one of the big takeaways here. And it's one of the reasons why you should be worried about something like closing the Strait of Hormuz, because you don't know what the consequences are going to be. You don't know what that one little spark is that's going to lead to, let's say, an energy crisis across South Asia, and how are perhaps some relatively unstable states going to respond to that, right? Like, it's not that climate change causes something, it's that people respond in such a way that creates a cascading series of events that can very quickly spiral out of control, and you lose sight of what the proximate cause of the triggering event was. And in some ways it doesn't really matter. What matters is the system in which all of that is happening, not causation per se.
Because there'll always be triggering events, and so the
Yeah,
question is really how you deal with them as a species.
yeah.
So Patrick, before we go, I'm just maybe as a final question, what do you think is the big takeaway from the book? Obviously, there are many takeaways, but like if you were leaving an audience that usually listens to the analysis of U.S. foreign policy and
Mhm.
imperialism and foreign affairs, I'm just curious, what do you think the big takeaway from analyzing this long period is?
I think there are really two things that we need to focus on. And the first is, things do not have to be this way. Nothing has to be the way that it is. That people have an enormous amount of choice, not only in how they set up their social systems, which is the great Graeber and Wengrow insight that we all need to carry with us, but also in how we set up subsistence, in how we set up economic systems, and how we set up political arrangements. Things do not have to be this way. When things change, we can change too. And if we choose not to make necessary changes, then circumstances are going to change things for us. Like, you can't just pretend that something isn't an issue and move on with it. Like, things are not going to take care of themselves. Like, one way or the other, you're going to have to pay the piper when the bill comes due. So that's number one, is that we actually have an enormous amount of choice in how we set these things up and how we deal with them. We have agency. We have an enormous amount of it. And this leads logically out of the first one, is that I'm not an optimist by nature, but I think this is an optimistic book. I am extremely aware of the bad things that can happen and that people do to one another. Like, I think more than a lot of people, I know how bad things can be. But it also makes me realize how many people have worked so hard for so long to make things better and viable, that, like, people care about their kids. They want their kids to do well and survive. Like, I want my kids to do well and survive. And, like, there is something really inspiring about realizing that you're at the end of thousands upon thousands of generations that have all had to deal with some pretty nasty shit. to get to where we are. Like that your existence today, my existence, the existence of the world that we live in is a miracle. And that we are playing some small role in pushing that forward. And the question I end the book with is like, what are you going to do for your kids? How are you going to leave the world a better place? Because we are not the end of the story. We are the beginning of some stories, we are the midpoint of others, and yeah, sure, we are probably at the end of some things. But like there is going to be a tomorrow. There is going to be 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 5,000 years from now. There will be people. What will they say about what we did?
That makes me want to
So
play Silver Chairs tomorrow to end the episode.
Silverchair. My God, that's a pull. I haven't thought about Silverchair
That
in
is that's
'Dude,
15
intense.
they
years, man.
rock. They
That's
rock, man.
well
Check them out again. Now
now
you're gonna
now
listen
I
to it.
now I know what I'm putting on. I was gonna make a playlist anyway. Now I know what I'm putting on it.
Dude, they were 15. You're making a lifting playlist. You put on Tomorrow, Pure Massacre, Anthem for the Year 2000. You're rocking out.
This is okay. I'm in. It's getting hot here. The working out is getting tough. I'm gonna need some motivation. That may be exactly what I need.
Some angry 15-year-old Australians from the mid 90s.
Oh, I
You
love
can't
that.
go wrong.
Oh, I love that.
Well, Patrick, the obviously we'll have a link for people to buy the book in the show description, Lost Worlds. Uh, but I'll give you the last word here, maybe to talk about past lives and what you're doing there, just so people can get a sense of that.
Yeah, so I've got a new podcast. It's called Past Lives, and every episode is about a real ordinary person who lived at some point in the past. I'm starting to sprinkle in some more topical episodes that are more like what I was doing on Tides of History. I'm starting to sprinkle in a few interviews as well, just because there's people who are doing cool stuff, and I want to talk to them. But you can find Past Lives for free anywhere you get your podcasts. We have a Patreon with tons of bonus content. We've got a book club. We are currently reading Camilla Townsend's Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs. So we just read The Unwomanly Face of War, which is one of my absolute favorite books. So we're reading good stuff. I'm answering questions. We're doing video chats every couple of weeks. Come hang out with us. It's a good community. I think you'll like it. And read Lost Worlds. I think it's pretty good. I think. I hope. So
I started listening to the audiobook. I think you need to get a better narrator.
yeah, I know he does
But
fucking
yeah,
suck, man.
he's not
That
great.
guy. Stevie. I was recording that at this very famous recording studio in LA, The Village, and one day there was like a ruckus outside the studio, and the very nice German sound engineer was like, "I will go see what is happening out there." And she goes out the door, and she comes back in a couple minutes later, looking kind of shell shocked, and she's like, "That's what Stevie Nicks. Stevie Nicks was yelling." I'm like
As happens. I
yeah,
mean,
I'm like
yeah.
Stevie Nicks can yell at whatever the hell she wants. I literally ran into Thomas Newman, who did the soundtrack for like like the Shawshank Redemption, and I literally ran into him in the hall. He looked exactly like you would expect a composer of movie scores to look like. So that was a cool experience. But yeah, no, next time better narrator. We'll find somebody better.
Yeah, you're at that stage. You can do better. Patrick, thanks so much for coming on the program. We always love to have you. Again, the book is Lost Worlds. People pick it up and check out Past Lives. And we look forward to having you back.
Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for asking such great questions. It's always a pleasure chatting with y'all.